Yo, what's going on everybody? It's FreakyDude99 and welcome back to another Destiny 2 Endgame build video. This time I have a fabulous Prismatic Hunter to give to you today. This build works perfectly with Act 3 and the new artifact perks that dropped, as well as utilizing the full power of Prismatic to absolutely decimate any piece of content that you step into. Whether it's Grandmaster Nightfalls or the Expert Encore exotic mission, you will go into it with whatever weapons you want and absolutely decimate all of the enemies while staying super duper mobile and being able to just have so much fun with all of the arcing and jolting and movement capabilities that you have with this build. With nearly infinite transcendence uptime and super fast super regen, it is just so much fun to be playing this build, and I'd love to share it with you today. Now, of course, with all my builds, there's going to be a picture at the end along with a dim link in the description for easy copying, and if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button because it helps this channel out a ton and it makes sure you don't miss out on any Destiny 2 videos that get posted on this channel. So of course, with all that said, let's jump into the build. Now, starting out with the subclass, of course, we are running Prismatic, which gives us access to the Transcendence Grenade Hailfire Spike. This grenade is absolutely just amazing at taking down bosses and champions, as you can stick it right to them, freeze them, ignite them, and cause so much damage, as well as clear out tons of ads if you happen to stick it on a wall. Now for our super, we are going to be going Silence and Squall, but with your super here, I will say that you can mix it up depending on what you want to do. Personally, I really like Silence and Squall because you can throw it out, you can have it going while you're around just dealing more damage, it freezes, it slows enemies, it just does tons of damage and clears out tons of ads no matter what situation you're in, and it's really nice to have in Grandmaster Nightfalls, especially when there's just hordes of enemies pouring out of every single wall and you need something to just lock down the battlefield. Now moving forward from that, our class ability is going to be Gambler's Dodge. This is so whenever we dodge, we gain a recharge on our melee ability instantly, allowing us to throw out our melee ability in rapid succession if we need be. Now we won't be using our class ability much, at least we won't be using our dodge much because of one of our aspects, but again we'll get to that later. Moving over to our melee, we are using Threaded Spike, which is a really nice melee to have as it severs enemies, which lowers their actual damage output, allowing us to survive a little bit longer in endgame content, as well as it bounces around between tons of enemies before coming back to us, allowing us to catch it and refund our melee energy. This means that Threaded Spike can be up nearly always because whenever you catch it, it at least returns around 1/3 to half of the melee energy, allowing you to just have this constant uptime on it going and also get off a decent amount of Darkness Transcendence energy damage. Forward from that, we are going to be using Arc Bolt Grenade. While on its own, Arc Bolt Grenade is a little bit more niche, but with our exotic Lucky Raspberry, it gets a huge buff, allowing it to jolt and stun overload champions, allowing for just a lot more interactivity with it, as well as generate ionic traces, which allow us to get class ability energy back, grenade energy back, and melee energy back, allowing for a constant flow of all of our abilities with this build. Now moving forward from that, we are going to be touching on our aspects, and the first one is going to be Gunpowder Gamble. Now Gunpowder Gamble can be a little bit more niche as it requires you to actually build up the amount of elemental debuff damage takedowns or solar weapon takedowns to actually charge up the amount of charges that you need to get your Gunpowder Gamble, at which point you can throw the grenade and cause a massive solar explosion that also causes ignition. Now the thing with Gunpowder Gamble and this build is that all of the jolting that we are doing actually fills up those little boxes for us and fills up those charges, allowing us to get our Gunpowder Gamble insanely quickly. It does tons amount of damage, allowing you to clear out groups of enemies or just get a massive amount of damage off on a boss or a champion, and it's just a really nice slot in for this kind of build. For our second aspect, we are grabbing Ascension, and Ascension's really nice here because it allows us to use our class ability up to propel ourselves upwards and cause a burst of energy below us that is going to amplify us and jolt anything below us. This means that if any enemies are coming up towards you and getting real close, you can just jump in the air and pop your Ascension to just jolt all of them beneath you, cause a great amount of damage with all the jolting that it causes and electricity damage, and then as well as it amplifies us for about 15 seconds and with the amount of ability regen that we have with this build, we actually get our class ability up nearly constantly before Amplified runs down, allowing us to actually have a permanent uptime on our Amplified. Amplified is going to be giving us a bunch of buffs, not only with its normal speed boost, but just with the artifact perks that are available this season. It means that we are going to be having a ton more survivability and a ton more damage that we can actually get off. Ascension is really nice and it's a little bit more of a niche pick, but with this build it becomes an absolute top tier pick because of just what it can do. Now moving on from the aspects and going over to the fragments, first of all we are grabbing Facet of Hope. So while we have an elemental buff, our class ability regenerates more quickly, and this pretty much just creates a loop between Amplified on us and our class ability regenning more quickly, allowing us to just get our Ascension back super quickly and not have to worry about that elongated cooldown. Forward from that, we are grabbing Facet of Purpose, so whenever we pick up an Arbor Power, we get a buff associated with the damage type of our super. Since we are running Silence and Squall, that's going to be granting us Frost Armor, and Frost Armor is a stacking damage resistance. The more stacks of Frost Armor you have, the more damage resistance you have. This means that if you were to run something like Silk Strike, you would get Woven Mail, which can help in certain positions as Woven Mail is a huge amount of damage resist, so it all depends on what you kind of want to use for your super to coincide with Facet of Purpose. The only thing I will say is don't really run Storm's Edge. Storm's Edge is a really nice super, but it means you are double stacking Amplified, which you don't need to do with this build. Forward from that, we are grabbing Facet of Balance, so when we rapidly defeat targets with light damage, we're granting ourselves melee energy, and rapidly defeating targets with darkness damage grants us grenade energy. This means that all of the light damage that we are doing with Arc and Solar from our Gunpowder Gamble, our Arc Bolt Grenade, and our Ascension is going to be granting us a huge amount of melee energy, which means that whenever we are throwing out our Threaded Spike, we're dealing that darkness damage, and we're going to be granting ourselves grenade energy along with that. Facet of Balance is really nice to have on any prismatic build, as it ensures your ability uptime is super high and means you can throw out more grenades and more melees than you would normally be able to. Forward from that, we are of course grabbing Facet of Protection, which is a choice for any prismatic build. While surrounded by combatants, we are more resistant to incoming damage, and while Transcendent, this effect is increased. This means that we have a lot easier time actually being in the middle of battle, being able to jump around and staying mobile instead of just having to stay back and plink away at enemies. We are also grabbing Facet of Awakening, so rapidly defeating targets with light or darkness damage or super final blows generates an elemental pickup of the matching damage type. With all of the arc damage that we are doing, it's going to be granting us Ionic Traces. With Ionic Traces, it means they are going to be tracking towards us and granting us grenade, melee, and class ability energy, allowing for a bigger loop on all of our abilities, as well as it means that when we do our Gunpowder Gamble, it's going to be spawning that Fire Sprite, and Fire Sprites grant us grenade energy, allowing us to throw out even more Arc Bolt grenades than normal. And finally, we are using Facet of Sacrifice, so while we have an Arc Solar Avoid buff, ability final blows grant bonus Darkness Transcendent energy. This is the only Transcendence energy that we have a little bit of a tough time actually generating, because we are using all our Arc Bolt and Gunpowder Gamble and Ascension. That's a lot of light damage, which means darkness damage falls a little behind because we only have our Threaded Spike, but with Facet of Sacrifice, that gets a little more balanced out and allows us to actually generate that Darkness Transcendence energy and get our Transcendence a lot more quickly, allowing for a near permanent uptime on it. Now that's going to do it for the subclass. Let's move on to those weapons. Starting out with the weapons, our main weapon of choice is going to be none other than the auto rifle Centrifuge. Centrifuge has been a little bit more of a niche pick depending on your kind of playstyle, but with the recent artifact perks granting us Overload Auto Rifle, as well as a bunch of other auto rifle related perks, it means that Centrifuge has quickly gone to the top of my list and one of my favorite auto rifles to be using right now. Just the sheer fact that it synergizes so well, because whenever we're sprinting it gradually reloads this weapon. If you have the catalyst, it means while you're amplified it gradually gains overcharge on it. But the main thing here is that when you are at full electrostatic charge, it's going to be increasing the range and reload speed, as well as final blows will cause an explosion that is going to be blinding enemies nearby. This already means that it stuns Overload champions if you shoot next to them, but also it means that we can stun Overload champions and cause a whole lot of debuffing on enemies around. And blinding is really useful to have, especially in endgame content, because that just negates an enemy's ability to actually fire on you or actually deal any damage. Blinding an entire battlefield around you with just your auto rifle is huge, and the fact that it synergizes with all of our amplified stuff means that it's just a perfect slot in choice for this build. Centrifuge is just really nice to have, but of course there's some other weapons out there depending on what champions are out there and you have to face. Of course, if there's no overload champions that you are facing, then you might want to swap in something like Risk Runner. Risk Runner is a really nice submachine gun, and with anti-barrier submachine guns in the artifact perks, it means that you can slot it in there, along with if it's barrier and unstoppable, you can use something like the Call in your kinetic weapons and then Risk Runner in your energy weapons, allowing you to cover those two champion types. Risk Runner also reduces arc damage on you, granting you arc resistance and just chaining lightning damage between everything, and it's really fun to use, especially if you haven't used it in a while, because submachine guns have fallen off just a little bit. But with this build and with some of the champions and activities that you may be doing, it's perfect to slot in for this build, get that arc damage off, and then use something like a special weapon sidearm in your kinetic slot. Something like the Call, of course, is what you're going to be using, as the Call can also roll with things like Demolitionist and One for All. Demolitionist means that we just have even more arc bolt grenade charges that we can be throwing out, allowing us to just cause massive amounts of jolting on the battlefield, get our gunpowder Campbell up more quickly, and just also have an extra source of Darkness Transcendence energy damage. But if you're using something like Centrifuge, a good thing to slot in with that is a sniper rifle for anti-barriers, which you can get a lot of kinetic sniper rifles out there. Personally, I've been using Succession, which you can get from doing the Onslaught activity and focus that at Zavala. Succession is really nice as it can roll with stuff like Vorpal Weapon, allowing you to actually just burst down barrier champion shields, as well as deal a lot of damage on things like champions and bosses, and make up for a little bit of extra damage that you might not have had. Of course, from that, there is a heavy weapon that you can be slotting in. There's pretty much any heavy weapon that you want to use you can throw in here. Me personally, I've been having a lot of luck with the Speleologist, which is the new solar machine gun that dropped from Act 3. This thing can roll with Envious Assassin and Incandescent, as well as it has the Radiolaria Transposer origin trait, which drops little Vex arc pools on the ground, granting us even more arc damage with this build. As well as Envious Assassin just allows us so we never have to reload, and Incandescent contributes to stuff like Gunpowder Gamble, along with it being solar, so you just get more charges for that Gunpowder Gamble, and you have something that you can just pull out after stunning a champion and just laser down their health bar before swapping back to your Centrifuge to stun an overload, or to your Succession to pop that barrier. Of course, whatever heavy weapon you want to use, you can use. This build is super versatile in the weapons that you can actually use, but of course we want to make sure that we're using some sort of auto rifle with this build. But it's not absolutely vital that you do use an auto rifle, because of course you're using Risk Runner in certain situations. Again, it's your choice here, and if you find certain weapon choices work best for you, then of course use those, and maybe just leave a comment saying that they work, because again, this build is very versatile in what you can do with it. Now that's going to do it for the weapons. Let's move on to those artifact perks. Starting out with the artifact, in the first column we're going to be grabbing 3 anti-champion perks. This is for whatever champions you are facing and whatever weapons you are running. Of course, we want to make sure that we are using Overload Auto Rifle, which grants us overload rounds on our Centrifuge, as well as it's going to be overcharging the weapons associated with their actual frame. So with Overload Auto Rifles, it's going to be granting Overcharge to all auto rifles, and Overcharge is a 25% damage buff when you are an expert or higher content, and when you are in stuff like Grandmaster Nightfalls, that's going to be coming in huge handy because you're going to really notice that damage fall off if you don't have it. Going over to second column, we're going to be grabbing Overcharged Armory, so weapons with the Dealer's Choice, Radiolaria Transposer, Collective Purpose, and Sundering origin traits are always overcharged, and all of those weapons we are pretty much using, like Speleologist or the Call. All of those things getting that 25% damage buff is going to be huge for us. Along with that, we are using Logic Reductor, so weapons with the Radiolaria Transposer Origin perk deal increased damage to Vex, as well as it extends the duration of the Radiolaria pools created by Radiolaria Transposer. This is going to be coming in huge handy with our Speleologist because we pretty much have that as our heavy weapon with this build, and those arc pools come in huge handy, especially when you're dealing with waves of enemies. Moving forward to third column, we're going to be grabbing Press the Advantage, so whenever we break a combatant's shield, it's going to be granting us increased weapon stability, handling, and reload speed, which is really nice to have on some of these weapons like Speleologist or Centrifuge, which have a little bit of a lower reload speed depending on what you're doing. It's really nice to have and just kind of a slot on perk because none of the other perks in third column work, except for of course Sustained Fire, which makes it so continuously damaging combatants with an auto rifle will grant us damage resistance. This is huge for using an auto rifle with this build and Centrifuge because that damage resistance comes in huge handy, especially in Grandmaster Nightfalls. Moving forward to fourth column, we're grabbing Radiant Orb, so while we have our Prismatic subclass, whenever we pick up an Orb of Power, we're granting ourselves Radiant, which of course grants us anti-barrier for our weapons that don't have any intrinsic champion stunning abilities, but also grants us a damage buff on those weapons, as well as we are using Galvanic Armor, so while we are Prismatic, incoming damage from combatants is reduced while amplified, which is huge because we always have amplified going with our Ascension spam. And then of course we are also using Targeting Autoloader, so while we have an auto rifle equipped, defeating combatants reloads your equipped weapon and temporarily increases your weapon damage, as well as it awards bonus progress when dealing final blows while surrounded, which we're pretty much always surrounded in Grandmaster Nightfalls, especially with this week's Grandmaster Nightfall Devil's Lair, which there's just tons of enemies constantly surrounding you, and pretty much if you're a hunter you want to be surrounded. And for fifth column, we are using Shield Crush, so while we have our Frost Armor, our melee is going to be recharging faster and deals increased damage, and while we are Amplified or Radiant, our Grenade recharges faster and deals increased damage, just really nice to have on top of everything. Along with that, we are using Shock and Awe, so while we have Prismatic equipped, Arc Final Blows while we are Amplified summon a burst of lightning that damages and jolts targets. This is of course why we want to have Amplified running all the time, because Galvanic Armor and Shock and Awe just synergize perfectly, and especially with this build we just have tons of arc damage that we're dealing, allowing for all of these bursts of lightning to just clear out the battlefield and just deal tons more damage. And it's just so much fun as well to see all of these lightning strikes across whatever activity you are doing. Now that's going to do it for the artifact perk. Let's move over to those armor mods. Starting out with the helmet, we're going to be grabbing Ashes to Assets, which we gain bonus super energy on grenade takedowns. We are getting tons of grenade takedowns with our arc bolt, so this comes in huge handy and allows us to get our super back more quickly. We're also using Heavy Ammo Finder, so all of our primary weapon takedowns with our exotic weapon is going to be just getting us more ammo for our heavy weapon, whatever we use for that. And then we are also using Arc Siphon, so our rapid arc weapon final blows create orbs of power. Really nice to have because of course we're using Centrifuge a lot of the time, and Centrifuge can create orbs of power, which just allows us to get our super back more quickly. Now before we move on from that, let's quickly touch on stat focusing. Firstly, you want to make sure that your resilience is at 100. Having tier 10 resilience means you have a 30% damage reduction against all types of damage, which is huge when you're stepping into stuff like Grandmaster Nightfalls or Export Encore, because there is just so many times where enemies can one-shot you, and having that 30% damage reduction means you can just live for a little bit longer and survive where you need to. Second, we want to make sure our discipline is as high as possible, ideally at 100, because of course we are spamming out arc bolt grenades as much as possible with this build. And then third from that, you want to balance out your three stats between mobility. So mobility is higher, which means you can actually use Ascension more. You want to make sure your recovery is decently high so you can actually regain health a little bit more quickly. And then of course you want to make sure your strength is a little bit balanced out as well, because the more times we can use our threaded spike, the more energy and darkness energy that we can generate for using our transcendence, as well as generating some grenade energy that we may need to have. Down to the gauntlets, we're going to be grabbing a double stack of firepower. Having 2 stacks of firepower on means that whenever our grenade gets final blows, it's going to be generating orbs of power, and it's going to be on a lower cooldown than just having 1 firepower. Since we're throwing out our arc bolt grenades so much, it means that without this we won't be generating as many orbs of power, allowing us to just get our super back super quickly. as well as we're grabbing 1 stack of impact induction, so all of our powered melee damaging is going to be generating grenade energy for us. Down to the chest piece, we have our exotic Lucky Raspberry with the intrinsic trait probability matrix. This makes it so it increases the chaining capabilities of arc bolt grenades, which makes it so it actually damages enemies with jolt lightning strikes, as well as it allows it to generate ionic traces, which grant us additional arc bolt grenade energy, as well as it makes it so it stuns overload champions and delays their health regeneration, which is huge, especially if you're doing something like a Master Lost sector or you're in Grandmaster Nightfalls, because overload champions can generate their health super quickly when they're not stunned in that. This is just such a fun exotic to have because it means Arc Bolt goes from a really niche grenade pick to an absolute S tier grenade that can just deal so much damage, cause so much jolting, as well as generate ionic traces for us, which just grant us a lot more energy for our Arc Bolt grenade, as well as for our melee and our class ability. It's just a really fun exotic to be running, and I highly recommend that you try it out. Now for the mods, of course, whenever we are stepping into an activity, we're going to be checking whatever that current threat modifier is and matching our damage resistances to that. So if you're jumping into an activity and it has an arc threat, you want to be going ahead and matching that with a double arc resistance, and then you're going to be grabbing a third elemental resistance that is different from that to balance yourself out. So if you're jumping into something like a GM, it has arc threat, you grab double arc resistance, and then a solar resistance on top of that to just balance yourself out and make sure you're covered on multiple damage types. Down to the leg armor, we are grabbing double arc weapon surge, which is granting us a boost to our arc weapon damage while we have an armor charge. Really nice to have, especially with centrifuge, as centrifuge without it can be dealing a little bit less damage, but with it, it means we can clear out tons of enemies, and with centrifuge's range and its handling, it comes in huge handy because we can just use it as our main weapon and don't really have to swap over to our heavy weapon or special weapon unless we need to stun a champion or burst their health down. Along with that, we're going to be grabbing a recuperation, so whenever we pick up an orb of power, we're going to be replenishing our health from that, which is of course really handy in endgame content, as any sort of health regeneration is huge for survivability. There's so many times where I'm just low on health, I'm almost down, but I see an orb of power, or I generate an orb of power, and boom, I get back up and I can keep going. And finally, for the class item, we're going to be grabbing a double font of restoration. So while we have an armor charge, we have a plus 50 to our recovery, massively increasing our recovery stat, allowing us to just get our health regen started so much quicker than normally be able to. And since this is a build that we are diving in a little bit more with our ascension, we want to have that capability. Along with that, we are using proximity ward, so we gain an overshield while performing a finisher. There's many times where champions are low and you're going for that finisher and they're surrounded by enemies. This means that you have an easier chance of actually getting in, getting the finisher off, and getting that overshield, allowing you to just get your health gen restarted or actually survive the onslaught of enemies that are surrounding you. And that is going to do it for the build. Now, this is a build that I've whipped together, I've been using for a little bit, and I knew that I wanted to be using it with this artifact perks from Act 3. Having shock and awe and all of the auto rifle stuff means that we just have a huge amount of damage resistance and jolting that we can be doing. The amount of lightning strikes happening on screen is just so much and more than I have ever seen, along with centrifuge actually coming in super handy with its blinding and all of the arc damage that it deals. And then paired along with Lucky Raspberry and Prismatic, you just have such a fun time, because of course all of the jolting is a debuff on an enemy, and when enemies are debuffed and you take them down, that grants us a charge for Gunpowder Gamble, allowing us to throw out Gunpowder Gamble non-stop and create these massive solar explosions, which just adds so much damage to this build. For your general kind of ability loop, you're going to be throwing Arc Bolt Grenade first, going in for an Ascension, and then of course throw out that Threaded Spike to just clean up enemies around that. Make sure that whenever you get your class ability energy back, you are popping an Ascension to keep that amplified going for that damage resistance, as well as the ability to actually proc your Shock and Awe and those lightning strikes. Threaded Spike we pretty much use whenever our grenade isn't up, because that way it generates some darkness transcendence energy as well as darkness energy for fast to balance, which adds some energy to our grenade. So anytime we throw out our arc bolt grenade, we follow that up with the threaded spike, and we pretty much get that arc bolt grenade immediately back as long as we can catch our threaded spike, allowing us to consistently have it up along with our arc bolt, allowing for a massive amount of ability regeneration and ability looping with this build. It is just such an overpowered build that absolutely slaughters every single piece of activity that you go into. Whether it's Grandmaster, Nightfalls, I've just been absolutely decimating them, running them back to back to back, and cleaning house, generating the most orbs of power on my team as well as getting the most takedowns, and just contributing so much to the team with all the blinding, the jolting, the damage you do, the amplified you proc for you and yourself, as well as pulling out Speleologist for all of those Vex pools that drop on the ground. There's so much that this build can do, and it really takes full advantage of what Prismatic is capable of, allowing you to chain together all of these different damage types, along with just absolutely outpouring a massive amount of jolting and arc damage that is pretty much unwarranted, and you cannot even see this amount of arc damage normally on arc subclass, which means Prismatic is just so much more better in that regard. Now, of course, with this build, there's going to be a picture on screen for easy copying, for if you want to take a picture, take a screenshot, and there's going to be a dim link in the description if you like to copy through that and save it into your loadouts on dim. Other than that, if you have any recommendations of stuff you think you should swap out or weapons you should swap out, of course leave that in the comments as I try to respond to everything down there. And if you enjoyed this build, be sure to hit the like button and leave a subscribe to not miss out on any future build videos or Destiny 2 videos that I may post. So, thank you so much for watching. I have been FreakyDude99, and of course we'll see you in the next video. Peace out.